Well, hello again. Here we are with the asbestos issue now, dealing with the IICRC S520, R520, S500, and R500. The problems we have with buildings today is most people don't understand the building materials that are in them. This is also the reason why I've made several other videos that seem unrelated to this. It gets into a whole category of what I want to specialize in with Times Dark Captains, my company, is large asset or facility management with respect to moisture, mold, and asbestos requirements as well. Our modern buildings are built more with water-sensitive materials. I've got a video on that available on my YouTube page. I've also got a video on the lost art of the asbestos management plan. Both of these are now required because we can't let buildings stay wet another 2 or 3 hours. And in dealing with some of the issues of our mitigation efforts, we're going to come into materials that we don't know whether they're asbestos or not. And in that situation, we need to assume they contain asbestos. That's usually default. So anyway, we're going to delve in a little bit. This will be a shorter video than most of my other videos, dealing specifically with asbestos and the IICRC methods of drying and mold remediation and the standards that they deal with and the specifics to asbestos in those particular standards. So stay with us. All right, so you have a building, it's full of water, you need it dried, you need to get back in your building as soon as possible because you're losing money. I get it, I understand that. But there's a problem of there's a whole group out there who, again, they want to rip and strip and go and get money, and as long as they turn and burn, get it done in 4 or 5 days, and they're out of there, they got their money, you got your insurance coverage, and bang, off you go. Well, all things being equal, that's fine. But there are other issues that can come about, such as building materials that may have asbestos, people tearing out walls or doing flood cuts with no containment whatsoever and no knowledge base of the asbestos materials in there. Now, with my previous video dealing with the IICRC and the Texas mold rules, there's also the Texas asbestos rules. But I want to go through the main rules we have dealing with asbestos and lead right now. We have the asbestos in schools rule that's what we call AHERA, the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. It requires every elementary school to have an inspection and a management plan done. And that way, if you're water drying a school, all you got to do is go to the designated person. Each school is supposed to have one, and go like, where's your asbestos survey? That way you know what is asbestos and what is not. And whatever asbestos material that has to be dealt with, well, then you have the proper people come in and deal with it. Have to have clearance afterwards, you would do that as well. Now, some of these asbestos implementations vary by state. Texas is very, very rigid, whether it's friable or non-friable. It's regulated in our state in public commercial buildings, any amount, friable or not, that's regulated. Other states go with what they call Kneeshaft levels, or maybe a small-scale, short-duration project, usually dealing with friable or what we call RACM. Now, in my management plan video, I talk about all that, just like I talked about all of Texas mold remediation in my Texas mold remediation regulation video, separate from the IICRC and the Texas mold rules together. Again, there's a lot of moving parts here. The other one we get into is Kneeshaft. Now, Kneeshaft is about emissions and not having asbestos emissions in the air. Mold may be a health problem and is probably an allergic health problem and is definitely a health problem to people who are sensitive. And there may be some carcinogenic issues in there, but we don't know. We do know that asbestos is carcinogenic. I mean, there's a whole set of regulations for that specifically. And Kneeshaft is one of those, National Emission Standards. So if you're renovating or demolishing a building, of which some of our drawing projects would be a asbestos removal, because you're removing asbestos that happens to have mold on it. And, you know, we always go around this, well, does asbestos trump mold or whatever? Does water damage trump everything? And it's like, no, water damage is the last one. Water's not carcinogenic. So you go with the carcinogenic. toxicants, and that would be like lead. Just recently, Home Depot got hit for $20 million. $20 million. And because they weren't following the lead renovation, repair, and painting rule in residences. And we're going to get a little deeper in that. Now, Kneeshaft deals with 4 units and more residential, and then all commercial buildings would be under that. And usually rack friable material are rendered to where it's going to be, asbestos is going to be released from it. And then our key level with Kneeshaft nationwide is 160 square feet or 260 linear feet. Then we get into OSHA. Now, Kneeshaft and state regulations in HERA apply to usually non-residential situations. OSHA applies to all work sites, whether there's a building or not. Even if it's a trench with asbestos cement pipe in it, that's covered by OSHA. There's no building at all. Residences, OSHA is basically commerce. So if you hire a company to come in, they have to protect their workers. So they would have to determine if you, the building owner or the homeowner, doesn't know it's asbestos or not. They would have to determine whether it contains asbestos or not. You can only rebut presence by testing the material. Now, under OSHA, we generally regulate this under 1926-1101, or the construction industry for asbestos. So again, we've got several rules right off the bat that state that you must comply with these. The mold and the water damage is really voluntary. I know it's not, because you got to take care of that problem. That's why you came there. But once you start dealing with asbestos, lead, other hazardous materials, it is regulated under those. You can't say, well, I'm doing water damage, I have to do my water damage job, and we do the asbestos later. And this is, again, it is backed up in all these standards. The water damage standard and the 2 standards dealing with the reference for the mold remediation, the water damage, and then the standard for mold remediation. So the R and S520 and the R500 and S500. So it is addressed. Now, we also have, in Texas, we have the Texas Asbestos Health Protection Rules. And as I said, it applies to any public commercial building. And when we talk about a public building, we're not talking about publicly owned. Public or privately owned that the public can come into that is regulated. And again, the Texas rules, I'm not going to go into those. It takes us a long time. It's more than just a quick 30-minute or 20-minute video on YouTube to deal with this. So anyway, the asbestos rules take precedence over everything, and so does the lead rules. The lead rules under EPA, the RRP, only apply to child-occupied facilities, where a child 6 years in age of younger would be for a certain amount of time, or usually there regularly, or a target housing prior to 78. And again, these are really big issues. And currently, the EPA clearance standards were reduced from their former 400, 250, and 400. The new rules go into effect in March of 2021, which is 10 micrograms per square foot for floors, 100 micrograms per square foot on windowsills, and 40 micrograms per square foot 400 micrograms per square foot in window troughs. So that's coming up, so they've reduced those. So there are things that do take precedence over these standards, and these standards clearly say so as well. So we now have to address the issues from Kneeshaft and Tapper. As I said, Kneeshaft is any facility for residential units and more residentially. So some apartment complexes that are more than 4 plexes would be in that requirement, and any commercial building. And in Texas, of course, as I said, it is your any public or commercial building, any amount. Now, some states, such as Georgia, actually regulate their houses. So it does vary by state. When I say that EPA, they don't usually regulate residences unless it's part of a commercial commercial enterprise. They're not going to get into that. The state of Texas is pretty much like that as well. Again, they stay hard with the 4 units. The issues of these things, again, you must know that a lot of our restoration people just go in and go like, well, we got to dry this out. And when they do drying, like drywall's the #1 thing we deal with, and that can have asbestos in it, even brand new buildings. This is One thing I have dealt with restoration people, I was on the phone just a couple weeks ago before making this video, and I said, well, the guy goes, well, anything after 1980 doesn't have asbestos in it. I'm going like, that's not true. We just had in the 2020 congressional session, they tried to advance another asbestos ban in there, and it didn't go anywhere. So, but that's being said, we don't really have a ban for asbestos materials, and you can have these materials come back positive. What rate? It's probably a lower rate, but again, you can't assume negative. You always have to prove it's negative. So it's what we call rebutting presence, and OSHA requires you to rebut presence. And this guy on the phone was, well, it's theoretical. I go like, no, it's not theoretical. It's pretty straightforward. You have a suspect material that may have asbestos in it, that could have asbestos in it. It's hot until you prove it's not. And that's why we rebut. You don't test to show it's there. You test to prove it's not. And that brings in why I wrote the lost art of the asbestos management plan. If you are in a brand new building, you need to have an inspection now, not when you get a restoration, not when you get anything, because your building's going to get wet. You could have a flood, you could have a pipe break, you could have some kind of accident, whatever. And now you're going like, well, we don't know if it's asbestos or not. Well, you're costing yourself days. If you already had that information, you could just go ahead, pull it out of the file and tell your restoration contractor, it's here, 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 and here. Go get the asbestos guys for that. You can start on this other side over here. And that's why we have a problem. Oh, you only have to get an asbestos survey before you get a permit in the state of Texas. If you have a city that requires it, and no, that's not the case. You need a permit. You need an asbestos survey, not when you need a permit. You need an asbestos survey when you own a building. And that's what I have said before. I maintain that. You can, if somebody was preloading these requirements and had any inkling of any curiosity about this, and if they were really absolutely concerned about having their building down one more day than necessary, you'd have a survey first, so you don't have to wait to get an asbestos survey if you got to dry it out. And that's where we get into this issue. Now, in residences also, if you're in pre-78, we do have a end date for that. So in residences and child-occupied facilities before 1978, you have to be a lead renovation, repair, and painting organization, and your supervisors, if there's no federal funds involved, you would have to have your supervisors or people would be called certified renovators, and they have to take an 8-hour class and utilize lead safe work practices. Now, the great thing about lead safe work practices in our standards and everything, you are required to do that by other issues. So it's really kind of a paperwork issue and an acknowledgement. It's not, we shouldn't be whistling past the graveyard on this one as well. And it shouldn't be really a real problem to deal with this. Now, because I'm in Texas, one of the things every licensee has to ask is they must inquire from the client whether any hazardous materials, including lead or asbestos, is present. It's a requirement. So there shouldn't be this issue in mold or asbestos where we're trying to determine whether this material has asbestos or lead. Our building owners should know, and if they don't, well, they should say they don't. And then at that point, either you test or it's positive. And that's how it goes. Now, when we talk about the TAPR or those regulations, that would require licenses on the commercial and the public building and residential more than 4 units. But if you're doing individual houses or fourplexes or less, like duplexes and triplexes and quads, you could actually train your own people and just do asbestos abatement residentially. And you would comply with OSHA doing that. Again, OSHA already requires you to do it. You should be doing it. And if you're not doing it, just ignoring it and boring holes in the wall so you can dry out would be a violation of OSHA. And so this is where we get into part of the issue again, where people go, I'm following the IICRC standard. Are you really? So let's delve into it and see. So you've seen me take out these books before in the previous one, and what I have here, I've taken all my markers out, and now I've replaced them with white markers here. And I'm just going to go through the parts of what's going on as far as the requirements and the statements of what this says. Now, the references that are adopted by the IICRC committee that developed the IICRC S520. They identify 29 CFR 1926 occupational safety and health in the construction industry. So the entirety of 1926, which includes asbestos and lead in construction, hazardous materials, confined spaces, fall protection, working surfaces, slips, trips, and fall, again, all that stuff, they have it adopted by reference here. The next one they have is is 40 CFR 61 Kneeshaft, National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. They have that listed here. Now they also have the OSHA Safety and Health Administration General Duty Clause. But since we already have a lead standard and asbestos standard, it's beyond the General Duty Clause. It's not one of these things you have to determine. So they already know about it in writing this standard here. Now on page 28 and 29 of your S520, the standard, we have 8.5, and it says asbestos. It says asbestos regulations are found in the construction industry standard in General Industry 19-10. Okay, and it says here, remediators are responsible for identifying and controlling asbestos exposure during demolition or removal of materials. If remediators encounter materials containing asbestos or presumed to contain asbestos that has been or potentially will be disturbed during the course of work activities, they shall. Remember our deviations from the standard? You shall, you have to stop. So that means if you don't know what it is, it's hot. And if you don't have the qualifications to deal with it, you got to go get somebody else who does. Okay. Qualified abatement contractors shall be engaged to perform asbestos abatement. Many states and local governments can. And that's why I said the difference between residential, you could just take your training and certification and do the workplace hazards on 4 units and less. 4 units and more, you'd have to get licensed under the state and work under the Texas Asbestos Health Protection Rules. Now, not only that, this is very proactive. Now, most of our asbestos requirements are 1% greater than 1% is ACM, and that's where all the rules kick in. Not the IICRC S520. Both 29 CFR 1926-1101 and 1910 state regulations apply anytime there's asbestos present. A clarification letter in OSHA means any detectable amount, whether the amount is present is greater than 1% or not. Both regulations also contain requirements for dealing with less than 1%. So it's very, very proactive. There's no discussion here. This standard says you shall comply with the asbestos. So if you don't know, for instance, you go into a material owner, oh, it's all wet, you got to get in here and dry it out so we can open the store in 2 days. And you ask them if they have an asbestos survey. And they go, no, but it's new. I'm pretty sure we didn't use it. And you go like, well, we don't have an end date. So now if you have your own people trained, or if you got a licensee, you can get an emergency requirement, and then you can poke your little holes in there for drying in the wall. If you're doing flood cuts, you could probably start doing some of the water extraction, but the flood cut could not occur if that material was containing asbestos materials in a public building. Here in Texas, again, we cannot composite. So if drywall joint compound is on the wall, we do not composite that. So if you get hot joint compound, the whole wall would have to be dealt with in a public building by a licensed person with clearance and everything else. So if you went ahead and did that, that would be a violation of the Texas Asbestos Protection Rules. And that would be, again, if you did some of the water drying nonsense where these guys go in and just do a flood cut with no containment over the entire building and it's asbestos containing, you could have an asbestos containing cleanup on your tab. And we can find that out with the debris. So you better clean up if you do a violation. Now we also talk about lead as well. Construction work that involves lead is a regulated process in many jurisdictions. This includes OSHA, OSHA 1926.58. It is the construction lead industry standard. This includes work that involves lead-based paint or other structural members. Now the OSHA standard is lead at any level. The EPA is above 1.0 milligram per centimeter squared or 5,000 parts per million by weight. Remediators shall be responsible for identifying and controlling lead exposures during demolition and removal of materials. If remediators encounter lead-based paint, they shall stop activities that disturb lead-based paint and proceed with appropriate controls. In the United States, restorers shall be in compliance with the U.S. EPA's Renovation, Repair, and Painting Program for lead-based paint on surfaces and coatings. So if you are following the IICRC S520 or the S500 in drawing, you also have to be an RRP certified renovator and a certified renovator firm if you're working in pre-78 residences or pre-78 child-occupied facilities. I mean, it's right there in the standard. Okay, the other thing we get into in the preliminary determinations, and this is not a little sketchy. This is in the building inspection part, and yeah, here it is. It's on page 38, and it's part of 10.4. And it says, during the inspection process, the presence of hazardous or regulated materials that might be disturbed during the remediation process shall be determined and documented. Shall be determined and documented during the inspection phase, not when you're cutting the flood cut. You shouldn't be cutting the flood cut if you don't know what it contains, or unless you don't have something in your hand that says, yes, we tested it and it's doesn't have asbestos in it, or less than 1%. Okay? Remediators shall comply with federal, state, provincial laws regarding the handling of hazardous materials or regulated materials such as asbestos and lead-based paints. Okay? So it's very clear in this standard that asbestos and lead is part of the program. And we'll go to R520. This is the R520. This is a section, again, I'm going through these processes, provide for safety and health of the worker or occupants. And, okay, after that little delay, we're going to go into page 79 of the R520. And here it is, asbestos regulations can be found pretty much, or presumed asbestos are highly likely to be encountered in a mold remediation project. So they already have said in the standard, these materials are likely to be encountered, okay? ACM is defined as any material more than 1% asbestos by weight. Even if the building owner does not have a survey for asbestos, the mold contractor is still responsible for identifying and controlling asbestos exposure during the demolition or renovation of materials. Remediation of workers encounter ACM or PACM, ACM or PACM during the course of work activities, they shall stop. There's no gray area here, either in the standard or in the reference document. Qualified asbestos abatement contractors shall be engaged to perform asbestos if such materials to be disturbed. Many states require, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the same thing is said for lead that we said before. And again, you got to be part of an RRP program firm, and you also have to have RRP as well. So that's very much on the mold side. Now we get into the S520. This is where we're actually doing flood cuts for water damage. And it really starts pretty abruptly here. This is on page 25 of the IICRC S500, and it says asbestos. 8.7, asbestos on page 25 again. These regulations shall be followed. They're talking about OSHA. Whenever a detectable amount of asbestos is encountered or is presumed to be present and might be disturbed, the restorer shall receive awareness training to ensure potential hazards are known and properly identified. That's just to be working around it. If you're working with the material, then you got to comply with OSHA at the various training levels and usually have a 40-hour supervisor for asbestos overseeing it. Asbestos-containing materials might be found in buildings of any age, including newly constructed buildings. So even the S520 knows this. So we don't have an end date. You can't say, well, it's newer than 1980, it doesn't have it in there. It's probably less likely, but we don't know. We always have to look. Okay? So again, they're talking about even if the building owner has a survey for asbestos, the contractor is still responsible for identifying and controlling asbestos exposure during demolition or removal of materials. If restorers encounter materials containing asbestos that are presumed to contain asbestos, have been or potentially will be disturbed in the course of activities, they shall stop activities that can cause friable materials to become aerosolized. The licensed abatement contractor shall be engaged. Remember all these shalls? These are all shalls. If you're going to deviate from the standard, you have to deviate from why you're not complying with state licensing requirements if necessary and OSHA worker protection requirements, which are required. Lead is the same thing. Oh, I said 5.8, it's 6.2. 29 CFR 192662, not 5.8. 6.2 is the lead standard. Lead construction work includes those with lead-based paint or other structural members containing lead, so it can be less than 1%. And then the pre-78 buildings, residences, and all pre-78 commercial buildings that would be child occupied. You have to be under the RRP. So restorers shall be in compliance with the U.S. EPA. Okay. Now here we go to page 36. This is 10.4.2, and I believe this is in the inspection and preliminary determination, which the contractor or the water drying company deals with. If regulated or hazardous materials is part of the water damage restoration project, then a specialized expert may be necessary. Restorers shall comply. Again, how many times have you heard this? You shall comply. There's no reason why you can't. Regulated materials posing potential recognized risks can include, not limited to, arsenic, mercury, lead, asbestos, polychlorinated biphenyls, pesticides, fuels, solvents, caustic chemicals, and radiological residues. For situations involving visible or suspected mold, I already went over that one as well. But qualified persons shall abate regulated materials or should remediate mold prior to drying. Again, these things are front loaded. The last thing you take care of is the water. You have to remediate the carcinogens, the toxins, and then the health effects before you take care of building materials. Building materials get wet and can degrade, but they don't get sick. They don't need a doctor. Okay, we get into principles of water damage as well. And the yeah. So this is in the section, this is in page 90. This is in the S520, chapter 1. I think this is the reference guide. So the standard is in blue generally, and then the reference is in white here in S500 land, R500 now. And it says provide for safety and health of the workers or the occupants. And it says here, water damaged buildings and materials and investigation and performance of water damage restoration can create and expose workers to a wide range of health and safety concerns. Potential hazards include, not limited to, exposure to microbial contaminants, chemicals, lead, asbestos. So it's already in the list as well, right there. Okay. So we go over to 152 in the R, the reference of the R500, and it basically says the same thing, almost verbatim, as what was in the R520. Basically said you can come across these materials when drying out. Even if a building owner has a survey, you're still responsible for identifying and controlling exposures during demolition and removal of materials. So it's pretty clear that the asbestos needs to be dealt with first. And I don't know why it is such an issue. And this is why, if you are a restoration contractor or a water and drying company, and you do a lot of residences, you should probably just go ahead and get a couple of guys supervisor trained under the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act of a good certified training company in your area. You should also get your workers 32-hour trained for asbestos as well, and they could work, barring any state rules. Like I said, Georgia does regulate houses. Most states don't, but again, you have to check state by state. Texas does not regulate houses either. So you could go ahead and you've already got the tools. You got the air filtration discharge, you know what containment is, you just need to follow a few extra tricks in dealing with asbestos and you won't have any delay. Remember, this is a $13 billion per year situation. There's enough money in here, and most of the time insurance covers, even in the residential, the asbestos removal costs. So this is something you should probably you're leaving money on the table here. I know in Xactimate there is a line item for this too, in water restoration and in mold remediation. So it's you're leaving money on the table too. So this pretty much is it for the asbestos part. Again, if you want to know more as a building owner or facility director, I recommend you go to my materials and mold sensitivity, mold and moisture sensitive materials video. And then also I've got the Lost Art of the Management Plan. That's about an hour, but it covers all these regulations and all the ins and outs of some of the requirements dealing with asbestos, not mold. Anyway, the facility management and large asset preservation industry, I think is going to be growing. It's going to be changing a little bit. Probably not as many sales of facilities and less demand on them. But those that do have demand on them, we're going to have to be Johnny on the spot and get them done. The economic conditions could considerably degrade with respect to real estate and facilities and large assets. But we still need to keep these safe because in all these situations, and again, if you go in and somebody knocks all the drywall off and you got drywall dust all over and some pipe insulation and whatnot strewn about, and somebody comes in and now you get a lawsuit because of asbestos because some water restoration company decided for you that your risk for that, because they're going to be gone. That's your risk. And contractors and people coming into other buildings need to stop determining for building owners what their liabilities are. Building owners are fine dealing with that. And you will be opening yourself up to liability. Again, the standards are pretty clear. So if you are an asset manager and you do have some water damage people that cause problems, get a hold of me. We can take care of those. Especially if they invoke IICRC S500, IICRC S520. If they invoke the standards and then do not execute those, if they did not follow the deviation from standard process, they would be culpable and probably liable. So I think if there's any attorneys also out there that want to discuss this more, you can get a hold of me through this channel. And not only on YouTube, but we will be on Rumble and also BitChute as well. So that's pretty much it for the asbestos portion. Again, comments are welcome. Share the video if you find value in it. I really do appreciate making these for you. And they do take a little bit of time. So if you've got an extra cryptocurrency in your pocket and you're worried about it going to zero, I'll take that off your hands. Anyway, till later, I hope you fare well.